the key on Monday when I arrive, because Mr. Kutsia is going doing research already on the 14th, so he won't be on campus necessarily.
I'll be on the conference in the Western Cape.
Is it from this Monday? The
No,
following one.
I'm departing the 14th. I'm back the 9th.
I wonder if we should start. Some people...
Yes. All right. Good day, everyone. My name is Robert Benjamin Ace. I am a lecturer at the Department of History at Northwest-Universiteit here at the Mafeking campus, and I will be sharing today's seminar. This is the second presentation at Northwest-Universiteit's Thursday History Seminar Series. These history seminars are the initiative of today's speaker, Dr. Laura Phillips. If you are interested in presenting at the seminar, please contact Laura. Her email was on the invite. We have some exciting speakers lined up for this semester, including Andy Manson, who will be launching his new book. We have Bernard Mbenga, we've got Jill Kelly and Shepo Molloy, all scheduled to speak before December 2022. Laura's research interests lies in the Bantustan's political economy and mining, and today's presentation is part of a working paper entitled Strong and Stable to Productive and Disciplined Class Formation and New Pathways to Accumulation in the Post-Apartheid Civil Service 1994 to 1999. So welcome everyone, and I'm going to give over to Laura now. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to speak, sorry guys, I'm going to speak to the online audience as best as I can. And thanks very much to everyone who's joining in online. I'll say it one last time. And sorry if you've heard this already, this is new technology. So if you are struggling to hear at any point, just unmute yourself and let us know, or put a message in the chat and we'll quickly try and address the problem. It's very nice to see so many people from all over the show, and I'm very grateful that everybody is joining in. The presentation that I want to give today is a working paper. It's a paper that I'm in the process of trying to develop into a chapter for my broader book project. So these are ideas that I'm kind of still formulating, and would really greatly appreciate feedback and comments as to whether you think they work and what does work about them. And I'm going to try to be quite strict about the timing. I'll try to speak for just under 30 minutes, but Robert will interrupt me if I'm going way over. And then if we could just start the PowerPoint, there's just some maps and little things I want to show you as I'm speaking. Okay, so I'm going to begin while the sharing screen is getting up and running. So the broad argument of the book that I am putting together comes out of my PhD thesis. And the argument that I'm trying to make is that the South African state becomes increasingly important, though of course not the only significant driver, but an increasingly important driver of accumulation and class formation in South Africa, and particularly in the more rural parts of South Africa. What exactly this looks like changes, how it is that the state acts in this role, how it underpins class formation and accumulation changes over time. But despite these changes, I'm trying to draw a thread to pull out how it is that the state is serving this function and serving this purpose over a period of about 40 years. The site, the case study that I'm using comes out of, and you'll see how this is significant in a bit, it comes out of my research on the former Bantustan of Leboa. And if you can move on to the next slide, those are all the Bantustans in pre-94 South Africa colored in different colors. You can see Leboa is on my screen, it's like a bluish color towards the top of the northern part of South Africa. Yeah, that's it. So I'm using Leboa as the case study. It was the Northern Sotho Bantustan. For those of you who perhaps don't know all that much about the specifics of apartheid history, South Africa was split into these 10 Bantustans, these ethnic homelands by the apartheid government in an attempt to try and facilitate and justify further racial segregation and claim that each ethnicity of South Africa had its own homeland and sovereignty, ultimate sovereignty. So this was the homeland for those who were designated Northern Sotho speakers. This presentation today builds on the fact that it's situated in the post-apartheid period, but in the region that Leboa was incorporated into, which is the modern day or contemporary Limpopo province, though at first it was only called Limpopo in the early 2000s. So I refer to it throughout this presentation as the Northern Province, which is what it was first known as. So that's kind of the broad overview of my argument and the particular of this kind of my entire project and the particular site that I'm locating this in. But let me say a little bit about how this particular paper fits into this broad argument. And for me to be able to do that, I need to kind of take you back a little bit into the Leboa era, into the apartheid period, to look at what the civil service meant under the governance of the Bantustans, or under the governance of the homeland governments. So in the pre-94 period, under apartheid rule, under the Bantustan specific governments, the civil service in the specific governments was often, though very small, said to be and rarely spoken about in terms of trying to legitimize the Bantustans by Africanizing local employees. So there was this emphasis on hiring local African teachers, nurses, administrators, civil servants, across the board to try to legitimize the government of the Bantustan, to say that this was truly governance, self-governance, this wasn't imposed by the apartheid state. There was also an idea that doing this, that hiring local African residents of the Bantustans would facilitate the creation of what was called a strong and stable middle class. And if you can move on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, that's another slide just of the provinces, though I'm sure everyone will know that. I can see that at least on my side, this next slide that I'm trying to show you is very faint, so perhaps you can't see that. But what I've highlighted there is a document talking about the importance of providing particularly housing to the civil servants of the Leboa Bantustan. And if you can see the second line in that orange block makes reference to the importance of this for developing a strong and stable middle-class society. And so to understand the significance of what happens in the post-94 period, you do just need to, I want to just give you a little bit of a sense of the language that was used to describe and the policies that were adopted in the Bantustans in the process of expanding and developing the civil service. And this was, as I say, very much spoken about, and we can talk about whether it actually achieved any of its goals, but spoken about creating this strong and stable middle class. And again, if you think about the Bantustan project, what this also allowed for was to try to prevent urbanization of a Black population, trying to create jobs in the Bantustans and tie people to what was said to be their rural homes. So this is the pre-94 period. This is under the Leboa government and under many of the other Bantustan governments as well. What I want to move us into is the post-94 period. And in this period, there are new pressures on the provincial civil service, on the civil service in general, and particularly as it plays out at the provincial level. And suddenly, or perhaps not so suddenly, the civil service is no longer being spoken about and conceptualized in terms of a vehicle for the creation of a Black middle class in post-apartheid South Africa. However, there is still, and this is one of the arguments I want to make, there is still a clear link between the way in which the civil service is conceptualized and an idea of a certain type of class formation or material underpinning that the civil service was meant to have. And this has implications then, and this is also the second part of the argument, for how it is that members of the South African civil service, particularly in the provinces, are ultimately able to accumulate, are able to kind of gather wealth. And though highly contested, the way that this post-apartheid civil service is being conceptualized is, as the title of this presentation suggested, as disciplined, as efficient, and as part of, though this wasn't in the title, an empowered class. And this means that their ability to accumulate is much more closely linked to the private sector than was the pre-94 civil servants' ability to accumulate as part of the Liberal government. And one of the key arguments I want to make is that it is their position as state employees, perhaps paradoxically, that many civil servants in the post-apartheid period are able to get access to the private sector. And this is the form of accumulation, no longer directly through government employment in quite the same way as it had been pre-94. Now government employment is a pathway into private sector accumulation. And I'll explain that in a little bit. Just some important background information before I go into this further explanation. Though many people will know this, let me just say it again, that the provinces, the post-94 provinces, are created out of the administrations of the former Bantustan. So in fact, if you could just go back a slide. There is what the provinces look like post-94, and Limpopo is then created, if you go back one more slide, out of the Bantustans in the northern part of the country. The administrations come together. Leboa, Venda, and Gazankulu are combined. Those are three separate Bantustan administrations are combined with the administration of the White Transvaal province to create the new province of first what is called the Northern Province, but then Limpopo. And this is a really key part of understanding the shape of the civil service post 94. And then another kind of key piece of background information that's important to know is that in the negotiations in the period from 1990 to 94, a series of agreements were made and decisions were come to that the new democratic South African state would not fire the civil servants who had worked under the apartheid state or the Bantustan states. They were guaranteed their jobs in the post-apartheid period. Okay, so what I want to do now is just go through I've got 4 different headings. I'm not sure if I'll have time to go through them all, but let me just kind of map out for you what it is that I'm hoping to do, and I'll speak to as much of that as I can. The first is that I want to explain to everybody what the state's thinking is about the civil service in this post-apartheid period, why it is that whereas in the pre-94 period, the state was, as I said, really thinking about the Bantustan civil service in particular as a way to drive this project of class formation. The new pressures on the state in the post-apartheid period means that the ideas around what the civil service could do, its role in society, are very different. That's the first thing I want to map out. Then what I'm going to map out is the pushback against it that was particularly coming from the unions. The third section that I want to talk about is what the resolution is. If the state wants one thing, unions are pushing for something else, what ends up happening to the civil service? And then I want to give you a few case studies just to kind of flesh out the point that I want to make. Okay, so let me begin by just speaking a little bit about the state's changing idea of the civil service. And the first thing to note here is that in the post-apartheid period, the South African state at the national level, but also at the provincial level, adopts a set of, you call them ideologies or policy positions that are broadly thought to be part of what is called new public management. And if you could flip there, yeah, perfect. New public management. Now, new public management is a series of ideas that come out of particularly their origins are said to emerge from Thatcherite Britain in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, where the state is thought to be often too cumbersome, that it needs to be constructed along business lines, that it needs to be thought of as lean, it's too big, it needs to be narrowed down, and this would make it much more efficient. The South African policymakers and administrators somewhat ambivalently, but nonetheless do adopt a lot of the tenets of this new public management. And what we have here on the screen is a document put together by the Premier of the new province, the new Northern Province, as I say, later Limpopo and Kwakura-Matlodi, speaking about the values of new public management or new performance management, which was a linked kind of set of ideas. There's many of us will kind of see this in our day-to-day life. Many of us have to also subscribe to ideas of new public management, despite what we would prefer, how we prefer our workplaces to look, where there is lots of ways of measuring your success, ways of making sure that the administration isn't too large, making sure that everybody's doing exactly what it is that they are said that they've been hired to do. So you can see how in a pre-94 period where class formation was really at the forefront of the minds of a lot of people who were shaping the civil service, now with this new pressure coming from new public management, where government is often thought to be too big, that there needs to be many more checks and balances in places, the civil service can no longer function, is no longer being thought of in the same way as it had been in the pre-94 period. A key part of new public management was the phrase and the policies that flowed from this rationalization. Rationalization was thought to be the kind of an idea that the state needed to be rationalized. Every part of it needs to be very clear, have a very clear role. It should not be too big. One of the ways to facilitate rationalization was was retrenching excess civil servants, redeploying people to where they should go, to other parts of the state, all part of making a lean state. And I can see, I see that we have there's some colleagues here from Zambia, and I know that Zambia was also part of structural adjustment programs. Many civil servants in Zambia would have also known the phrase rationalization and would have experienced the effects of new public management rationalization under broadly structural adjustment programs. So these are big processes that are happening not only in South Africa, across the African continent. However, they do have a particular flavor, not only in South Africa, but specifically in the provinces like Limpopo, which were constructed out of the former Bantustans. And the particular flavor that they had at this level, at this very local level, was that because of the structure of these new provinces, because they were amalgamated out of a series of other administrations in the making of the new provinces in 1994. And so instead of having one provincial structure for the entire province, what in effect was happening in Limpopo, the northern province, was Gazankulu's administration plus Benda's administration plus Leboa's administration plus the administration of the white state. If we can move on to the next slide, you can see here to some degree, I mean, you don't need to go through all the numbers, but this is a document that the provincial department put together, that the Limpopo province put together, identifying all the civil servants that they carried over from the pre-94 administrations into this post-94 administration. The last column, which maybe you can't see so well, but the last column identifies the number of posts that are being held for, just go back here, in the post-apartheid province. This is just illustrating the point that I'm making, so don't worry if you can't get too close and look at it. And I can explain there's some variation in some of those numbers, but the broad point that is to be made here is that the diagnosis of the provincial state in the post-94 period is that because they'd had to amalgamate all these different administrations, they ended up with a post-apartheid provincial administration and civil service that was, in their language, bloated. It was much too big. They did not have enough posts for the number of people that they had to employ, that they'd agreed to employ as part of the negotiations to bring about democracy. And so rationalization, the need to cut down the civil service, had a particular urgency. It was said in the post-apartheid provinces, particularly those provinces that were made out of the administrations of the Bantustans. There are a few other points that one could make here about the general drive and push to reduce the size of the civil service, but I'm going to just keep us moving. And yeah, I think we're going to skip the next slide. So let me move on to the next key point that I want to make. But let me just conclude with that to say there is that these double pressures of new public management plus rationalization, which is seen to be particularly urgent in the provinces, What these combine together is to mean that whereas pre-94, the Leboa state and other Bantustan states really wanted the civil service to be the vehicle towards middle-class formation, the new pressures on the state mean that what they're talking about in terms of civil service is the cutting down of it, is the making it more efficient, making it more disciplined. As you might imagine, there is enormous pushback against this, because potentially what this might lead to is the cutting of jobs, people being moved around all over the show. The groups who are pushing against this most urgently are the unions, particularly the public sector unions, NAHAU, SADTU, DENOSA, which is the nursing union. There are a few other smaller ones, but those are kind of the key players here. And the unions are really organizing hard against rationalization. There's protest after protest to say, don't rationalize our staff, don't cut our staff, don't redeploy them. These people were promised jobs, they need to maintain these jobs. There are huge protests to increase salaries, and many civil servants who are employed in the provinces and elsewhere are the beneficiaries of significant increases in salaries in the post-apartheid period. There is a standardization of the benefits like pensions and medical aid across the civil service as well. So on paper, what one sees is a civil servant, an individual civil servant who is benefiting quite significantly in the post-apartheid period from the demands that are being made by the unions on their behalf. That being said, however, there is some complication. In fact, there are quite significant complications in the demands that the unions are making. On the one hand, one might say, okay, the state is now pulling back from saying that the civil service is this vehicle for class formation, for middle class formation, but they're being counteracted by the unions who are saying, yes, give us more, give our members higher wages, etc. However, as I say, there are these complications with the types of demands that the unions are making. And there are two types of complications that I particularly want to emphasize. The first is this, and we can skip to this one. The unions, NAHAU, SADTU, DENOSA, are part of, DENOSA comes to this later, but a part of COSATU, the umbrella union, and it forms part of the tripartite alliance, which is to say that they have close political ties to the ruling party, to the ANC. And so in making their pushback demands against what the state is trying to implement, they're trying to walk a very fine line, which is really captured here in this quote from, from NAHAU, from a senior leader in NAHAU, who said, we cannot treat our comrades the same way as we did the racist regime. When we seconded our comrades to government, we knew that we were placing them into a battlefield, he said. This is from a newspaper article. We must support them and expose the other parties like the DP, that's the DA, and the National Party, who are working to reverse our victory. And what we really kind of see from this, and this really typifies the kind of complexity in the demands that the unions were making. What we really see from this is that while the unions are pushing hard to some degree against the efforts to rationalize the state by the ANC provincial government, they are bumping up against the fact that they also feel very close to the ANC government and they don't want to put too much pressure on them. A secondary issue is that a lot of a number of the unions, and particularly SADTU, the teachers union, cannot decide whether it wants to present its members as part of a working class or part of a professional middle class. And there is, I won't have time really here to go into the details of that, of professional unionism versus kind of militant working class unionism. But in making demands on behalf of their workers, sometimes you see that their language is language which says these are rights that are owed to us and our members because they are part of a working class that overturned apartheid. And sometimes they say, because the civil service needs to deliver middle class status to Black South Africans, these are the benefits that they deserve. There's this kind of schizophrenia a bit in the language. The third part of this is that in making the demands that the unions are making, they come up with a different way, a third way about how to talk about their union, their members, and what it is that they want for their members. And this is really based on the language of empowerment. It'll be a phrase, empowerment will be a phrase that will be kind of familiar to many people's ears. BEE comes out of the same world, Black economic empowerment. And what the unions are really trying to push for is, if we can move on to the next slide, this is SADTU's investment policy to foster economic empowerment and capacity building for the marginalized section of the community. And the comparison they're making is in the same way that happened under the National Party for the Afrikaners. And so in driving this effort to empower their members, SADTU and all the other and many of the other public sector unions are pushing for a series of policies that do what they say is empower their union members, which is to connect them, interestingly enough, to the private sector. Say government employees need to use their status as government employees to access services that are being provided in the public sector, like private pension funds, private access to banks, access to loans. And I'll speak about that in a little bit more detail. But let me just kind of round up that point then, is to say that while we have the state, which is really driving this process of rationalization, is thinking of the civil service in a very different way. On the one hand, to some degree, they're countered by the public sector unions who are saying, no, you need to make sure that our members get become middle class or get benefits. However, even in making that statement, a lot of those union leaders are very ambivalent about exactly what they imagine the civil services position in society to be. However, what they eventually settle on is what they are pushing for are benefits and a position in society which will empower the members of the civil service. So let me now go on to the third, and perhaps I'll round up after this. I can see I'm getting close to running out of time. 4 minutes. Okay, so what is the resolution? So we have on the one hand the state wanting the civil service to do one thing, unions wanting something else. What is the resolution? A decision is made that what is going to happen is that to facilitate increased wages, to facilitate improved benefits for the civil service, the state is going to cut only certain types of jobs. Jobs of low-paying civil servants in the name of outsourcing. I won't go into any detail about this, but that's probably a phrase a lot of people know. A lot of low wage, but people who relied on a steady salary from the state are suddenly outsourced by the state. And this is something that, though there are protests, ultimately the unions agree to. Teachers' jobs are protected, nurses' jobs are protected, janitors' jobs are not protected, cleaners' jobs are not protected, they're outsourced. And that's one of the ways that the state is able to rationalize, reduce the size of the people it employs while still giving some people higher wages. A number of other decisions are taken. There's a moratorium on new hires. No new positions are made available for a period of time. Some of the colleges, the training colleges, the teachers training colleges, the nurses training colleges are cut so that there are fewer nurses and teachers who are being trained. And let me say, as what then is adopted, and it really builds on this last point about empowering the civil service, is that what the state does to try and facilitate this empowerment of its civil service is open up PERSAL, which is the Personnel and Salaries Management System, how payments work for civil servants, to the private sector, who can automatically start making deductions from it. So if you have a loan and you need to pay it back every month, the banks don't need to go to you personally. They can go directly to your salary slip, basically, and take that money off your salary slip. And that is said, though it may sound counterintuitive, to allow civil servants access to credit so that they can get loans, and then they can empower themselves. They can do more things with the loans that they're taking out of the bank. What you may automatically anticipate, and this is very much the correct assumption to come to, is what that results in is enormous amounts of debt that people get into. And what I want to ask you to flip to next is, okay, we're going to move through that. Here's one example. Again, it's very faint, but just to give you a sense of the kinds of ways that the state was saying we are going to facilitate the empowerment of our employees, is a guarantee scheme for housing loans to officers and employees in the public service. The state said if people need a loan from the bank, we will act as surety. We will act as collateral for that loan. And you can go to the bank and say, don't worry, I don't own anything. I can't put down a deposit or anything, but I promise you the state promises to pay my salary. So let me have this loan. And this is one of the several ways in which the state said, okay, we will make some compromises with the demands that are being placed on us by things like the public sector unions, to say we will facilitate the empowerment of our employees by opening them up to more credit, letting them get out more loans, etc. And maybe I can show you one last document.
1 minute.
Okay, I won't even go through that. Let me just say by way of conclusion then, and sorry to move through this all quite so quickly. The result is that there are some people who are able to negotiate and navigate their way through the private sector loans and use the debt to their benefit. They don't, or rather use the credits to buy properties, to accumulate, but there are other people in the civil service for whom, despite the fact that they're getting increased wages and improved benefits, the fact that they are mired in debt, and debt is becoming a part of what it means to be empowered, that they seriously suffer under the post-apartheid administration. And one of the big points that I want to make is that this is particularly intense in the provinces such as Limpopo, the northern provinces, which were cobbled together out of the administrations of the former Bantustans, because some of the pressures to rationalize were so urgent in these spaces. Okay, I'm going to end there, if that's fine. Okay.
Thank you, Laura. That was fascinating, and I really enjoyed that. The way we're going to work is I'm going to allow for 3 questions at a time. Do you feel that's fair? And then we will, we'll give Laura a chance to answer those questions. If anybody who needs to leave also, it's a really good time now. I'm just going to open the chat to see if there are any questions there.
I think where it says more there.
Okay.
That's Annie.
Okay, all right. If you have any questions, now is the time either to type it or to unmute yourself and ask. Perhaps I can start off by just asking a kind of a general question that we always aim for our undergraduate and our honors and master students that are here. So can you perhaps speak about the type and variety of sources, but also archives that you had to consult to conduct this particular research? For those of our honor students particularly, and master students that are interested in pursuing a similar topic, if you can speak about that, maybe provide some insights. And then if anybody else has a question, please unmute yourself and or put up your hand or type in a question at the chat.
Laura, your presentation was actually an analysis of the status quo. I mean, that's what I appreciated. It actually put into my mind and my extra information where things happened like that in the 1996s. Remember the gear story, except that we decided to shy away from mentioning just gear in your presentation. Maybe it's for presentation purposes. But the gear was actually an epitome of what we're doing about here. You're going to nationalize, you're going to reduce the project, civil servant, etc. So that was key. That's why it was criticized. Indeed, the criticism resulted in this paper that we're talking about. That because the criticism mainly came from the labor for certain people, and that when you do that, you're not doing what we thought was going to happen. But what I'm trying to say is that your presentation is actually it's not only particular to Limpopo. It is commonplace in South Africa. All the provinces, it's gratitude. All the provinces voting, especially those, even those who did not come from different former Bantustan's. But what I want to ask here is, which is what when I read it yesterday and I listened to you now, I think I understand it even better. The pre-1994 civil service was intended to, that approach then was to create the Black Metals Association, not necessarily before. But the post the post-apartheid one was intended to mainly promote or prop up the black middle class as well. That was the major. Now, the question that I'm asking, of course, I do have a comment on what I will ask, whether even if the project succeeded, there would ever be equality, would ever be equality between the white middle class and the black middle class. I will comment after you. Thank you.
Okay, I see there's a Joel, I see your hand, but Elise also said perhaps just concisely repeat the question from the floor. It is not that clear.
I know that this is only the one with it. So maybe I'll try and repeat it again, and I'll try and repeat Peter's question and answering it. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So maybe can we, Joel, can you ask your question, and then Laura will repeat PG's question and then answer those 3 questions.
Yeah.
Sarah, I see you. You'll get your chance in the next round. Yeah.
Hey Laura, I don't have a question, just to say that this is incredibly exciting. I can't believe you've opened up a whole new frontier after your thesis. It's really cool to see the work develop. And yeah, I'm also selfishly about to write a chapter between 94 and 2000. So this really helps so much. So I just want to appreciate the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Perhaps then we can take Sarah's question.
Hi, yeah,
Sarah?
thanks. Great to hear from you again. So I'm not sure if my question is fully formed in my mind, but I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. I'm wondering if I know this isn't the point of your paper, but can there be an even further, slightly further back reading to the period of the Tolmanson Commission in the 50s and 60s and the urges to create a professional and stable farming class, a particularly gendered and classed one within the Bantu, and that being really important in the creation of the territorial authorities. And by the time we're getting past the 70s, I think the neoliberal influences. Anyways, just a comment on that. How does that factor into the discursive shifts, if it can be drawn into the same line? Okay, thank you very much. I hope that made sense.
Yeah.
Do you want a chance?
Thanks very much, everyone. I'm going to see if I can try answer as many of the questions as I can. Let me try and take them in order. So to Robert's question about sources, and maybe this can actually speak to Joel's comments. So Joel, for all his sins, read my whole thesis, which couldn't have been pleasant. But anyway, so he'd seen what is new about what I've done from my PhD. And some of the stuff that is new, and I would strongly recommend others who are interested in doing this, is going into the Union archives. SUD2 archives are historical papers at WITS. You have to ask permission to get access to them, but some of this information, particularly about the way in which SUD2, one of the things that I didn't get a chance to say was SUD2 not only, I had that little quote, but SUD2 is really going out of its way, like many of the other unions, to try and connect its members to the private sector. And they're saying, we as public sector unions, SUD2, NAHAWU, others, we should all club together, because together we have enormous market power. We have enormous leverage in the market. We should go to Sanlam, to Old Mutual, whatever, and say, we will bring all of our members to you. Give us some commission for bringing thousands and thousands of members to you for this life insurance policy, for this medical aid policy, etc. And we'll give a reduced fee to the members for those monthly premiums. And that kind of information and the thinking around that is all laid out quite clearly in those SUD2 archives. So what is often said to be quite difficult for historians who are working in the post-apartheid period is that you lose very quickly access to documentary material. For those students who haven't yet spent much time in the archives, usually you can't look at material, the archives won't let you look at material unless it's over 30 years old. And so you have to find these alternative ways of getting access to material that aren't just newspapers. Okay, you can look at newspapers, but one of these is historical papers. The other thing that I want to say about the source material is that while other parts of my PhD are kind of very much based on archival evidence for this chapter and one or two others later in what will be the book project. I'm kind of straddling the line between doing history and doing, I guess, ethnography, anthropology. And the part of my paper that I didn't get to speak to today was about who are the winners and losers in the system. And the way that I can figure out who the winners and losers in the system was spending a lot of time with former civil servants and hearing from them their experiences, doing life history interviews, but just getting a feel for who has which debt, who took out which loan, who was able to use this loan to do what. So a mixture of sources that are both archival, newspaper, and ethnography and interviews. And so that, Joel, that's kind of how I've kind of moved this project along, is trying to think about my work not as a bit ethnographic, but also getting into some of these post-94 Union archives as well. Yeah, cool. So then to PG's question, so I'm going to try and repeat it. He made a few points. The crux of the question, I think, was about whether there has ever been or whether it is possible to get equality between Black and white civil servants in terms of their middle class status. Is that
middle class, not whether it is civil servants?
Whether it's possible to get
the Bantustanis wanted to create a middle class.
Yeah,
That would equal the white middle class.
yeah.
But come the New South Africa, the project was stuck. So,
Yeah.
But now I'm saying, suppose it succeeded with the success of creating a middle class. You're saying what the gear and others have done, have stepped in that project. And if they have succeeded with that middle class, can you say middle class be the same? Would it be a type of a middle class where there would be equality between the white middle class and the black middle class? I haven't commented on that yet.
Yeah, so let me, okay, so I think that the question and the way that I would answer that is, had things like what we would refer to perhaps as neoliberalism and GEAR not been implemented, could the trajectory continued, and could there have been some kind of equality and some kind of middle class? So, and I do want to say something about GEAR and RDP as well, but to answer that specific question, I am not hedging any bets one way or the other, partially because the way that I am talking about the Bantustan's efforts to create a middle class is by treating them almost as like, the Bantustans were the fraudulent, they had no justification, no legitimacy. There was no ways that in these kind of little spaces across South Africa, there could be equal access to resources. And so the way in which the Bantustan officials were talking about middle class formation is a legitimizing way that they were trying to make their project of Bantustan independence and self-governing territories seem legitimate. Sure, they offered things like housing to some sections of society. Sure, they offered stable employment to people who perhaps didn't have that before, Black residents who didn't have any other way to access a stable salary. But it was the thinnest fraction of society. And so, can there be a middle class in a sea of enormous poverty? I mean, what is the middle class if, one person is, or one family member is accessing a regular salary but has dozens of dependents? So I don't really kind of want to make a claim as to whether this is a middle class at all. I'm more interested in the way that the Bantustans and then the post-apartheid state were claiming that they were doing so, and what policies they put in place to try and further that. And then if I can just make a point about GEAR and RDP. So the kind of way in which post-apartheid policy is spoken about in the literature and maybe in popular discourse as well, as you get RDP, it was a much more kind of for lack of a better word, egalitarian, progressive set of policies that were adopted. Then GEAR came with all its neoliberal blah blah stuff and policies around cutting civil service. Interestingly, it is in fact in the RDP policy that the first mention of rationalization starts coming up in terms of the civil service. So while one may be able to paint some broad brush strokes to say RDP was generally like this and GEAR was generally like this, this kind of concern around the size of the state was very much present in the discourse from day one in post-apartheid policy making. And I absolutely take your point that this was a feature that was probably common to almost all of the provinces, including the Northwest province, out of which the nwu-pukke was integrated or was brought into. But the argument that I want to make, though, you know, I think the argument that I'm making could apply almost across the country, but I think that it is a particularly, you see these dynamics in a particularly intense way in two provinces, the Eastern Cape and Limpopo, because they are made out of so many different Bantustans, and so that this intense urgency is present from day one to cut the size of the civil service. And then to Sarah's question. That is such an interesting question, Sarah, and I need to think about it in a bit more detail. And I think that, so Sarah's question is about, you know, if you look back to the Tomlinson Commission, about the creation of the reserves and later, which turned into the Bantustans, you hear regular reference to the efforts to create a farming class. And to what degree does this kind of link to later developments? Is this a different phase in thinking about the role of the Bantustans in broader South African political economy? And I would say absolutely. And the reason that I mean, some of you who join the call will know this already, but my project really begins in the 1970s and takes us to the post-apartheid period. And the reason that I started in the 1970s is because I think that that counts as a new period in what the thinking is around what the Bantustan's position is in South African society. So roughly up until that period, there is still, at least discursively, an idea that the Bantustans is supposed to support some kind of like subsistence livelihoods, that there should be agriculture, that there should be farming, that there should be a peasant class that is supported. However, roughly from the 1970s onwards, there is a change in thinking about what class status residents of the Bantustan should hold, what the ideal should be. And that is shaped in part by the need to make the Bantustan seem legitimate on an international stage, by trying to make them surprisingly, well, what may seem contradictory to many, kind of modern, I guess. And by an acknowledgement that particularly in places like Limpopo, this kind of happens a little bit later in the Eastern Cape or Ciskei and Transkei, but by like the 80s, by the late 70s, early 80s, the possibility of living off the land in Leboa is really dire. There's just drought after drought after drought. The feasibility of this being kind of an agricultural stronghold is harder and harder to maintain. And so there is this shift in thinking about what it is that the Bantustans should be fostering, what kind of class position they should be fostering. But thanks, that's a really interesting question. I'll have to think about it a bit more.
Thank you so much, Laura. We've got 3 more questions in the chat, and perhaps Laura, do you want to read the first one?
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to read Stephen's. So Stephen asks, can I say more about the specific forms that corruption took in this time period in this vicinity after the establishment of Leboa and after 94? Presumably mostly relatively petty theft and gatekeeping bribery within the civil service before 94, then after the changes you describe, and especially the shift to outsourcing, increasingly lucrative rent seeking via tenders. Shall I read the next question?
Yes, I just want to say I'm very thankful for the CHR, the Center of Humanities, also to be represented amongst the audience. Thank you, Arnaldo.
Thank you, Arnaldo. So I would like to hear more comments about the concept of comrades in 2 views. Comrades against the apartheid system, that we know what does it mean, and comrades after apartheid, where the access and control of socioeconomic conditions become some problematic issue among old comrades that fought against the apartheid system. Thank you, Arnaldo. I might have to read that again just to fully understand the question, but who are the comrades pre and post apartheid?
Yes,
So should I take that question or should I take Michelle's?
Shall we?
Should we take
first
both?
to Sidwell, because his question came first, and then
No, what I wanted to say was more of what Arnaldo wants to say.
Okay.
So talking about comrades in 2 views, comrades against the apartheid system that we know and then commemorate after the apartheid. But because I'm dealing with Potapartheid, I've thought of this question and now seeing that Arnaldo posted the question. I thought that maybe put it into context of Potapartheid. Because remember, we know that during the time of Potapartheid, the civil servants had a different ideology that they followed, and post Potapartheid incoming ANC comrades now they had to come and work with these with the faction that was with Mangombe at that time. I would believe they were pro Mangombe faction within the civil servants. Now with the ANC. With the ANC one, knowing Mangombe's attitude towards the ANC, that clash, that ideological clash that might have caused a destabilization or thwarting progress, because now you get two people, this Mangombe faction now is being presumed as now destabilizing because they are against the ANC. And this is according to the findings of Dr. Mlope in his PhD. That there were two separate factions in it, where these incoming ANCs, because they knew the attitude of Mangombe and civil servants towards the COSA-dominated ANC, now it became a clash because they couldn't really gel together or work together towards now moving forward with the now Northwest province. So I believe that's where the question was from. But I was asking in this context. I hope I was clear.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah.
Sorry, can we move to Sizwe's question?
Okay,
And
yeah,
then,
trying to incorporate.
then Elise will come back to you.
Okay. Shall we? Okay, so since Makaba's question is, were the loans the only way through which unions intended to empower their members? And I think I know what Sizwe is asking me to speak to there. So let me try do this. Maybe I'm going to start with Sizwe's because I think I have a clear answer on the other two questions. I'm going to have to kind of think a bit more creatively, and so I haven't always conceptualized them in the way that you've asked. But so to Sizwe's question about empowerment, so certainly what I kind of went over quite quickly is the demands that the unions were making for improved wages, for better benefits for their workers. And from what I can tell from the documentary material, those demands that were being made by union leaders and there were strikes about them, etc., were demands primarily framed as demands for kind of a better life, not demands to empower their workers. Empowerment, at least in the documents that I've seen and in the interviews that I've done, is usually spoken about in terms of a business, in terms of the private sector. Empowerment is a phrase that is used to reference the private sector and some of those investment vehicles that I was talking about. And so, I think that kind of in layperson's terms, we may say that the unions empowered in general. Of course, they empower people. If you have more wages than you had last year, that's, in kind of instinctively, of course, you have more power, you're more empowered. But in terms of the language that was used at the time, this is the distinction that I'm trying to draw. And it's particularly that part of empowerment that I want to say leads to a certain process of accumulation for some civil servants who are then able to access loans in a way that they hadn't previously been able to, but in other cases are then able to access loans that they previously haven't been able to, but then aren't able to pay those. So I'd be really greatly interested to hear if from your own experience or if anybody else in the call has seen empowerment being used in a different way, specifically as part of kind of labor demands in the post-94 period, perhaps to refer more to improved wages and that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, so now let me go backwards to Stephen's question about corruption. Could you move it up again a bit? I just want to see exactly how he framed it. So yes, okay. So there is yeah, one of the reasons that question is quite hard to answer is because of the documentary evidence. And so, I think Sizwe, maybe Mashala, both who are using a little bit of Bantustan commissions of inquiries for their respective masters might be able to speak to this as well. In Leboa and in many of the other Bantustans, a series of commissions of inquiries are put together, are established in the late 80s and early 90s by the apartheid state as the apartheid is falling apart. And those commissions of inquiries are primarily aimed at trying to uncover corruption in the Bantustans. And I think that one could argue that the commissions of inquiries held for the apartheid state the potential of trying to discredit Black governance. They tried to say, well, we tried to give Black people the opportunity to govern themselves, but here are all the ways in which they were corrupt. And there's been kind of some, I haven't seen much scholarly work dedicated to making that argument specifically, but that is my hunch for a number of, that's really my hunch for why not so many commissions of inquiry are set up at a certain point in the Bantustans. Not that, I mean, there is a huge amount of corruption in the Bantustans, but it's happening throughout. But it's interesting that all kind of these commissions of inquiry suddenly explode all at a certain period of time. And so there's kind of what corruption is uncovered and when makes it a little bit hard to think about kind of, what corruption looked like at different points in time. So in those commissions of inquiries, that being said, the corruption that is uncovered in the civil service is primarily about, if I'm thinking back to it, about nepotism, about giving jobs to family members or relatives in some way, and about pretty petty, as you'd say, storing of resources, using a tractor, which was kind of given for an agricultural project for one's personal gain. Pretty basic kind of, not large scale, but small scale rent seeking, I guess. In the post-apartheid period, there is, yes, a lot of corruption that starts developing around outsourcing and the tenders that are given to those outsourced companies. But there remain to be quite a lot of gatekeeping, and Satu and those of you who had Sarah Many give us a presentation last week or the week before at History Workshop will have heard perhaps her talk to some of this. Satu then acts as a much more powerful gatekeeper than any individual or small grouping of people were able to do in the pre-94 period over jobs, particularly of course in the case of schools. Thanks. That's it. I'm going to think about that a bit more and come back to it. I'm going to try and speak to Arnaldo and Mashtala's question. And PG wants to come in. Okay. So this question of comrades after apartheid, and comrades, Say again?
Comrades against the apartheid.
Apartheid state, then comrades is kind of a network of business connections post-apartheid. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that what I would like to say in response to that, and this is something that I need to think about in a bit more detail, is that a lot of what I think you're referring to is that a lot of kind of the tenders and some of the corruption that was happening that Stephen was making reference to earlier follow the lines of some of these comrade networks that existed during the liberation struggle. What I want to kind of add to the mix in this story is that, again, from some of the empirical work that I've done, is that there is an organization called nwu-pukke, the National African Federated Chamber of Commerce, which is established as kind of a Black business organization. People might know the name, but it's a Black business organization in the apartheid period. nwu-pukke aligned itself pre-94 with quite a lot of ambivalence, but nonetheless aligned itself to the ANC and the mass democratic struggle from the 1980s onwards. However, many nwu-pukke members that I spoke to in the former Leboa were very uncomfortable with some of the other actions that were being taken as part of the anti-apartheid struggle. A lot of these nwu-pukke members in Leboa had small businesses that were trashed, that were boycotted as part of the democratic, as part of kind of, what's the phrase, kind of making South Africa ungovernable. And so that they was very seriously, they were very, very, very seriously opposed to some of the comrade actions that happened pre-94. However, these were business people who had quite a bit of business acumen, had resources, and then were pulled into a lot of deals post 1994. So if I can just kind of spell that out a bit more clearly, is that the distinction of who is a comrade and who isn't a comrade becomes super murky if that's the lens that we're using to look into this, because a lot of people were aligned to, I guess, comrade activities like youth uprisings because they were also aligned to the ANC, but individually were business people who really hated it. But nonetheless, because they had muscle and financial power in the post-apartheid period, were part of some of these comrade networks post-94. I think that's a bit of a cop-out answer to your question, but I'm just going to leave it at that.
Sorry, I just want to say that this room is booked for 2 o'clock and the people are standing
Okay,
outside.
so we are going to have to wrap up.
So can we, if you have any questions and you want to continue this conversation, and sorry, Elise, I take note that we completely ignored you now.
Sorry.
But if you have questions, please email Laura and Elise. Laura will respond to your question by means of email. We apologize, but unfortunately this venue is booked now, so we're going to have to stop it here. But thank you so much for listening and for zooming in. And Laura, do you want to have the final word?
The only word is thank you very much, everyone, and thanks for all the questions and for attending. Thanks. Thanks, guys.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. What I was going to say about the white black middle class. The problem with the black middle class is that it depends.